Welcome to the Florida Bar Tax Section Podcast. This podcast is a production of the Tax Section of the Florida Bar. The audio recordings include free telephone CLE programs put on by the section, as well as other programming produced for you, the podcast audience. If you like what you hear, please rate and review this podcast in iTunes or wherever you listen. Nothing in this podcast is legal advice. Please seek counsel of your own choosing before making decisions that impact yourself or your business. Thank you for listening.
Welcome to the Florida Bar Hall of Champions interview series. This is the inaugural interview, and we have a wonderful guest here with us today. I am privileged to be here from where I sit in Tallahassee, Florida, to be on the phone with a living legend in the tax bar in the state of Florida, no other than Sam Ullman. If you work in tax in Florida, you already know who Sam is, and you've probably been to the Ullman Year in Review if you've gone to the annual meeting that we have each year, traditionally out in Amelia Island. Sam is currently practicing with the Bilzin Sumberg law firm, and I could give you an overview from his short bio out there, which says that he's a counsel in the firm's tax and estate planning groups, and it says that he regularly counsels clients on federal and state and local tax matters and business transactions, and works in the tax controversy arena. But that kind of bio wouldn't even scratch the surface of the reputation and respect that Sam Ullman commands in the Florida Bar Tax Section and beyond. So, Sam, thanks for coming on today.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the nice introduction. I'm quite honored. Thank you.
Well, we're honored to have you here as our kickoff guests to this Hall of Champions podcast series, podcast/YouTube/ wherever we can publish it online series. Because we found that we being the tax section of the Florida Bar have found that it's important to get people like you out and sharing your experience with the section in your career, because we find it very helpful to just spread that message, because people like you and have meant a lot to all of us that practice here in the state. So before we jump into some of these questions that we have, do you want to take a moment and fill in any blanks in that very abbreviated introduction and tell us what you're doing these days?
Sure. Thank you very much. Right out of law school, I graduated from the University of Florida in 1967. And right after law school, I wanted to be a tax lawyer. But at that time, the only LLM program, for all practical purposes, was NYU. Miami had a program, but I aspired to go to NYU, and it was just not possible. So I was very, very fortunate and was able to get a clerkship at the United States Tax Court for Judge Austin Hoyt, 2 years, and I left the tax court at the end of that clerkship in 1969. And start practicing in Miami. And I think that that opportunity to clerk for the tax court had a influence on my career in a number of ways. But for our purposes here, it got me started into tax controversy practice. When I decided I wanted to be a tax lawyer, I didn't feature myself as a tax litigator or, as we call it, tax controversy lawyer. But spending time at the tax court like that, I was able to get a feel for it. So although my practice was primarily transactional most of my career, I started doing controversy work, both federal and state and local, almost right away in my career. And so spent about 3/4 of my time as the years went by in transactional work, and about 1/4 of it in tax controversy. But I probably never would have gotten into that had it not been for my experience at the tax court.
You know, it is wild. for me, as I'm sitting here, I've been out of law school maybe 7 years here from where I sit, and it seems like as soon as I started becoming aware of the legal market, it seemed like every law school and their brother had an LLM program. So it boggles my mind a little bit to hear you say that the only LLM tax program that was worth a darn was up in New York, and online didn't exist right then then, right?
No. Well, Georgetown had a small one, and Miami had a small one. Other than that, I don't even. And NYU, of course, was, as Jack Freeland, then a teacher at UF and the founder of the UF Tax Graduate Program, as he used to call the NYU Tax Graduate Program, the mother church of tax law.
That's great. That's great. And you teach now at the UF Satellite Church of Tax Law, right?
Right. I do. I retired from active practice at the end of 2008, and decided that during that year, after I had given notice to the firm that I wanted to retire at the end of 2008, they talked me into remaining as a partner, and I later resigned that and became counsel. But for a while, and when they talked me into staying on and working part-time as a partner, my wife Barbara and I decided we probably ought to move out of Miami. And the reason was that if I was working part-time, I would wind up spending too much time at the office. So it was already possible to work remotely by 2008, which of course wasn't possible earlier in my career. So that's when we decided, we picked Gainesville as an ideal retirement community because of a number of features, including the university being here and others. And then after we had bought the house and were in mid-2008, and we're preparing to move to Gainesville rather, Mike Friel, then the director of the Graduate Tax Program, asked me to teach part-time at UF, which I thought was a great honor to do that. So I started in January 2009 as an adjunct professor, and have been doing it ever since. I'm still doing it.
Well, they are lucky to have you. What do you teach over there?
This semester I'm teaching civil tax procedure and have about 45 or 50 students. And then next semester, as you may know, the Florida Tax Graduate Program has a required paper, somewhat in the nature of a small thesis. And I'm supervising 9 or 10 students writing their papers next semester.
Well, that sounds like the perfect set of classes for you, especially the Civil Tax Procedure course, because I am holding in my hands right now a book by the title of Civil Tax Procedure, 3rd edition, and you are one of the authors.
Well, a few years, that book was originally written, our first edition was by 3 very, very fine professors, one of whom was David Richardson, a former chairman of the Florida Bar Tax Section, and he was then director and a professor here at the University of Florida in the Graduate Tax Program. And he, with Jerry Borison and Steve Johnson at FSU, did the first and the second editions. When it came time for a 3rd edition, and we all know tax law changes a lot, so there have to be updates and new editions every few years. When it came time for the 3rd edition, David Richardson did not want to work on it. He asked me to take his place in writing that 3rd edition. So I did, and that was a heck of an experience. I'm glad I had the opportunity, and I use that book in our procedure class now.
Well, it's a wonderful book, and I don't know Mr. Borison, but I do know Steve Johnson pretty well by now. And when I realized this book was out there, I went out and got one, and I had him autograph it the next time I saw him.
There you go.
So
there you
the
go.
next time I see you, Sam, I'm going to have to get your John Hancock right next to Steve Johnson's.
Be my honor. Be my honor to do that.
Tell me, and tell everybody who's listening here, if the listeners are practicing in Florida, then they will have certainly come across a rather infamous annual CLE program by the name of the Ullman Year in Review. How'd that come about, Sam?
I had gotten active in the tax section almost immediately upon my coming back to Florida after my tax court clerkship, which was 1969 when I came back to Florida. And the annual meeting of the tax section in the summer, now it's permanently at Amelia Island, but it used to be at different places. They asked me in the very early 70s if I would do for that particular meeting about a 3-hour presentation summarizing all the cases, rulings, etc., for the last 12-month period, estate tax, income tax, corporate tax, so forth. And I did. And then I did it one more year and one more year and one more year. Pretty soon it was an annual event. And frankly, it was very, very time-consuming to prepare that. So long about the mid-1980s, someone suggested, well, why don't you ask different people to do different parts of it? You chair it every year and have different people speak on state and local tax or corporate or partnership or whatever subjects are appropriate. So I did that for a few years, and then we shifted gears slightly and decided to start using young lawyers because it gives them an experience to speak before 80 or 90 other tax lawyers, get their name around, meet a lot of people, and so forth. And it was a very good experience for primarily young tax lawyers to be the speakers. Then finally, in probably about 10 or 15 years ago, someone suggested that we just call it the Ullman Year in Review. And they called and asked for my permission to do that. And I said, absolutely not. You refer to it as the Year in Review or whatever you want, but keep my name out of it. It's done for the members of the section and for the built the confidence to young speakers that we have. It's not done for me. Well, of course, they ignored my advice. And although I continue to refer to it as the Year in Review, it is popularly known as the Ullman Year in Review. And a few years ago, I'll tell you this story. I was walking from the hotel at Amelia Island over to the conference center for the program. And there were two young lawyers who I didn't know walking in front of me, and I was close enough to them that I could overhear their conversation. And one of them turned to the other and said, who is this guy Ullman? And the other one said, I don't know, but he's probably dead. And so I started off the program that year with reports of my death are highly exaggerated. But so I was afraid people would probably think I was dead if they named it after me. And sure enough, that happened. But anyhow, I'm not. I'm still here. But that's the story.
Still kicking.
Still kicking.
You know, that has become a wonderful program. And you know, I tell you, when I started practicing tax laws, specifically state and local, that was my entree. I mean, I do more Fed now than I have in the past, but it's still mostly state and local. The opportunities that were immediately afforded me through the tax section to get up as a young lawyer and go talk about something, you know, like I knew something about something.
You know a lot about a lot of things.
Well, I know now. I know more now than I did then, but you only need to bone up on a thin amount of material to look like an expert for 20 minutes. So I can personally attest that program that you helped boost up and keep going over the years has, in fact, been quite a boon to young tax lawyers in the state. So thank you for that.
I hope so, and I'm glad. I'm very, very glad to hear that. I'm not active in it anymore, but I'm glad it's still going, and I'm glad that it has helped people.
And the rumors of your death are highly exaggerated. Well, since we're talking about younger lawyers and lawyers that are coming up through the ranks, if you will, whether it's fresh out of an LLM program like the students that you're teaching right now, or people that are just sort of getting out there and finding themselves practicing tax law, which is frankly what happened to me. What advice do you wish someone had given you when you started practicing way back when?
Well, when I came off the tax court and started practicing law, I didn't know that there was a difference between law and lawyering. I thought that I knew a lot of tax law and that I would be able to, and I'd clerked at the tax court for 2 years, learned a lot there, and would be able to hit the ground running. Little did I know that I was very naive, and that it takes a lot of time to learn what I call lawyering, or this real skill of being a lawyer. Knowing the law is just the dues to get in the front door. Then you got to develop skills in lawyering. And that's what I tell our students when they're looking for a job or ask me, hey, I'm looking at such and such a firm or such and such an opportunity. And I say, what you learn the first, say, 3 to 5 years of your practice. Of course, it never ends. You always learn, but particularly those first few years is going to be really critical to how you practice and how your career goes. So I don't want you to concentrate solely on whether such and such firm is a good opportunity for me. I want you to ask who it is you're going to be working for. It might be more than one person. I want you to meet that person or persons and find out, make your own decision as to whether you can learn the skills of lawyering from that person or persons. Because if they have bad habits, too many shortcuts, failure to examine things in depth, too many assumptions, no in-depth research, things like that. If you learn those bad habits, it will affect your career forever. They're very hard to break. On the other hand, if you learn very, very good habits, you're well on the way to becoming a first-rate lawyer for the rest of your career. So I thought naively that I knew enough to hit the ground running. But I learned very, very quickly, that I had a lot to learn and adjusted my thinking accordingly. But I wish someone had told me in advance, you're not all that smart. Just, you got a lot to learn yet, so buckle your seatbelt and plan on learning. Find out who you're going to be working for and determine in your own mind whether that person can help you develop good habits as a lawyer.
I appreciate that, Sam. And I'm going to ask a follow-up question to that may dovetail with another of the discussion items that we talked about before this interview. When you say the difference between knowing the law and lawyering, I think it's pretty self-evident what knowing the law means. Having that baseline competency, if you will, to get in there and know what people are talking about, to speak the language and have the skills to find out what you don't know or find the answers to the things that you don't just natively have in your head. But when you use the term lawyering, could you break down a little bit what components go into that? And I think that dovetails with the question that was on our little bulleted list that we circulated before this, which is what makes a good tax lawyer? So what makes a good tax lawyer in terms of the practice of lawyering, if you will?
Well, there's some skills that every person has to learn, regardless of whether he or she is in tax law or unemployment compensation or whatever. The first thing is the care and feeding of clients. You have to learn how to deal with clients. And anyone who has good people skills is going to be able to learn that pretty quickly. So most everyone had a job of some kind, and it's used before law school, and it's used to dealing with customers. But now you have a professional relationship with these people called clients. It's a little bit different than a customer. So a young lawyer is going to be going to meetings with some senior or older, more experienced lawyer in his or her firm. And the way that person gets along with clients, good or bad, that's going to go a long way to influencing the younger lawyer's client skills, which I think are very, very important for building your career. Now, for tax lawyering in particular, one of the first things we have to learn is that in law school, we were given all the facts, and that was pretty easy, made life easy. But when we're in the practice of law, you have to determine those facts for yourself. And it's a long and tedious process, and it involves reading documents, talking to lots and lots of people. It's going to vary from case to case, of course. And then you'll have accountants and others tell you, well, here's what you need to know. Note that that person is deciding what you need to know, which is not appropriate. You need to decide what you need to know. So you need to keep asking questions. And development of those facts and how they fall into place is going to have a major impact on the analysis that the young lawyer does to determine what the applicable law is and what changes can be made to possibly, if that's the case, that's the assignment, to achieve the client's desired goal. But the first thing you have to learn is assembling the facts. Everybody wants to jump into the law because that's what we learned how to do and we like it. If we didn't like tax law, we wouldn't do this. So everybody wants to get in and do research, but that's not the first step. The first step is understanding the facts in depth, agonizingly. And then doing the research is tedious. It means not only reading the leading cases and rulings and chief counsel's advice, whatever else there might be, but it means reading everything else. Oh, I've seen that reg. I don't need to read it again. Well, yeah, you do, because there may be a phrase in there that you never thought about before, but it's going to be relevant to this case. So one of the lawyering habits that a young lawyer needs to learn, at least in my opinion, is if you're going to be a great tax lawyer, you first have to learn to be a great drudge, which means you have to spend more time reading and rereading and rereading cases, regulations, rulings, whatever it is, even treatises sometimes to help you get into it, which I like to do, until you're absolutely certain you understand the applicable law, then apply it to the facts which you've determined to come out with what the legal result is. Then if it's a planning assignment, which it often is, you have to say, okay, which of these facts hasn't really happened yet? What can you go to the client and say, well, I know your plan is to do X, but if you do Y instead, which gets you pretty much to the same place, you'll get a different, perhaps preferable tax result. And so it's the tediousness. Every good tax lawyer I know is agonizingly detailed in terms of ability to pound out differences in the authorities to come out with the right result. And a lot of that is judgment. Which ruling applies? Can I ignore this phraseology in a ruling, or is the IRS going to use that to beat me over the head one of these days? So you need to not only understand the facts and the law to apply it, you need to have a somewhat mature judgment, which is going to come from experience and watching other lawyers and how they exercise judgment, how he or she exercises judgment in order to get to the right answer and make the right recommendations. So those are the things that I think go into good tax lawyering. And when we interview people, used to, I don't do it anymore, I look for the person who is willing to sit there and not just read the black letter law, but read the whole thing and develop an understanding of it. Hope that answers your question.
It certainly colors in the lines of what's important in this line of work, and I very much appreciate that. Let me ask you a related question that gets to that issue of judgment, or at least it's closely related, kissing cousins, if you will. One thing that I find in tax law, and let me preface this by saying that all my training before I started doing tax work was commercial litigation, and I still do. I mean, it's about half and half in my practice: commercial litigation and essentially tax controversy work. And what I've found is that in my commercial litigation practice, you have this is what it looks like. You have facts, and the facts are what they are, and you do a little investigation, like you said, and you get clear on what the facts are, and then you go find the law that supports your position. And there's usually a lot of case law. There's usually sometimes statutes, regs, depending on what the actual issue is, but there's certainly case law. Now, in the tax world, though, and especially in tax controversy, which you're very familiar with, you have your facts, which are either given to you by the searchlight of what the taxing authority is paying attention to, and what you're able to investigate on your own as well. And then there's certainly going to be a statute, and there's certainly going to be a reg, whether you're talking about the federal or the Florida level. But then when I started doing this kind of work and then looking for the case law, I couldn't find a lot. It was actually shocking to me how little case law there actually is. So I would say that compared to other disciplines, tax law has a heck of a lot of gray area there in between what the statutes say, what the regs say, and what a particular client's facts might be. What's your take on how to approach that gray area? Because some people get the willies when they see it, and other people see opportunities. So how do you attack it?
Well, you're absolutely correct. There, for various reasons, one of which is often a lack of adequate case law, or lack of adequate guidance and regulations. There is a lot of gray area. And I tell people I live in a gray world, because half the time, a great percentage of the time, I can't say, yes, that's definitely deductible, or yes, that's a realization non-recognition transaction. I can't say that with absolute certainty, which is probably one reason we don't give so-called should opinions. We give more likely than not opinions, because there's always that gray area. Now, what that means is that the level of difficulty, the challenge with which we're faced every day, issue by issue, every day, is greater. Because not only do you have to really do a good job analyzing the law, but you have to understand how to spin the law, not misrepresent it, nothing like that, but just how to state the law in such a way in the tax controversy world, for example, as it supports your client's position, or in the M&A world where we try to structure transactions to get a certain tax result. You have to understand which authority you're going to feel comfortable relying on and how you're going to summarize that authority 5 years down the road, 3 years down the road, when this transaction is audited, and the auditor says, well, what you treated this as a realization non-recognition transaction, or you deducted this whole category of expenses. Where's the support for that? Although an auditor probably wouldn't say that. Someone up in the appeals office might. You've got to have the skill and accept the fact there's probably no case or ruling directly on point. There just isn't, for the reasons you just told me, Steve. There isn't. The chances are there's not. So you've got to be able to say, well, when you combine this ruling with the Smith case, here's the result. It's just the best result. It's the right result. So you got to have the judgment and the skill to do that while you're living in a gray area, because nothing is definite. Now, if I can take another moment in answering your questions, there's a lot of accountants involved in the practice of law. And Fred Murray, who is the current new director of the Graduate Tax Program at University of Florida, I heard a presentation he made to our students just recently. And he said, you're going to be in the same room when you're out there practicing with a lot of accountants. Fred was with accounting firms and law firms during his career in practice, so he's seen both sides. And he said he's not sure exactly why. He said maybe it's because accountants always want the asset column to equal the liabilities column, and they'll do whatever they need to do to make a match. They want things to be black and white. They don't like gray. Assets have to equal liabilities. Has to happen. Whereas we accept that the world is gray. So you're going to go to a meeting, I tell this to young lawyers, you're going to go to a meeting and someone in that room say, oh, this is definitely deductible. And then they're going to turn around and you say, do you agree? Of course, you don't want to disagree with your colleague, but you have to say, well, I'm not sure it's quite that clear, because you know what's going to happen. When that audit comes along and the deduction is disallowed, you're going to be called on to defend it, to litigate it. And so you've got to be very careful and honest with the client. When things are gray, you've got to say, yes, it is a little bit gray, but I think we can overcome that. And here's why. Here's the argument. So it's more likely than not that we would prevail, but it's not a certainty.
That was extremely well said, and I love that phrase, living in the gray world, because let me tell you, I think as soon as you said that, I finally understood something about my brain, because, people ask, what's the answer to, tax issue X, Y, and Z, and the answer is always, it depends,
Yeah, right.
Really simple, right? Let me just say this next statement, and you tell me how it hits you. This is something that I think is true, but I would love your opinion on it, and it relates to how accountants and lawyers work together in this world of tax law that we live in. what I've found, especially on the controversy side, is that when an auditor comes calling, the taxpayer's first call is always to their accountant. And
yes.
And the conversation goes something like, "I'm being audited. Fix it." Right? And then the accountant sometimes will bring in tax counsel, tax lawyers at that point if they have lawyers in their accounting firm, if they're a larger firm, or if they're a smaller firm and they have an established trust-filled relationship with a tax lawyer that they know they can trust to help them through the process. Maybe they'll call them at that point, but usually they don't. Usually they get into the audit and they figure that they can explain everything to the auditor. The problem, though, where I see problems happen is when an accountant describes what happens to the auditor or what happened in a transaction by saying, "Here's the data, I win." And the auditor says, "I see it differently," and the accountant says, "What do you mean?"
Yeah.
And where I found that lawyers can really bring a lot of value to that is being able to mediate between those two positions. Because you're right, you have people on both ends. The auditor is probably going to think the same way as the accountant, where everything has to be black and white. But as you and I have just been discussing, we know it's all gray at the edges. And that's where I see lawyers being able to bridge a gap in understanding in that world of audit defense / tax controversy. So that's my long statement. How does that hit you?
Well, you're right. You're right. You're in that meeting, and or the client has been notified that he or she is going to be audited. Calls the accountant first, who says, "No, this will be a slam dunk. Let your lawyer handle it." And of course, you're the same one who said a couple of years ago when the client was looking at the transaction, "Well, it's not completely clear that these are deductible or that it's a realization non-recognition transaction or whatever." So you've got to, you don't want to put the accountant in a position of hurting the client. So you've got to sort of mediate, and I think you do that by bringing the accountant around to understand that it's not entirely clear. Accountants, most of them, haven't been to law school. Not all, many have. But most of them haven't been to law school and don't really know how to read the authorities the way you do, the way accountants, the way lawyers do. The ones who have been to law school are able to do that without any trouble. But you need to, that's why accounting firms are hiring so many lawyers these days, because their research and writing skills are usually superior. I've been told that by hiring partners in accounting firms on multiple occasions. These are the areas where we try to hire lawyers because their research and writing skills and oftentimes their analytical skills are greater than someone who's had an accounting background. But you're right. If you can mediate harmony so that the accountants and the lawyers are advising the client the same thing, and then lock arms marching forward to achieve the client's goal, you've done a lot better. You've done a real service.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, just to clarify, I wouldn't want anyone to take my conception of the different ways that accountants and lawyers tend to look at things as any sort of a criticism. It's a very different skill set.
No, it's not a criticism.
I mean, when I'm looking at, I know what a general ledger is, but I need the accountant to tell me what each category means in order to translate it into English. So I very much live and die by the CPAs that we work with. Well, Sam, as we sort of bring this to a close, let me just ask you a final question here, and then we'll ask you to tell us where people can find you on the internet and all that sort of thing. But what lesson do you think is most important for people listening or for students in your LLM program to take with them as they start practicing as tax lawyers?
Well, I think there's a couple things. First of all, our practice differing from many other practices. And I've always, not always, but the great majority of my career, I've been with large law firms that had real estate departments, commercial litigation, so on. So the first thing I think that people have to accept is our practice is simply different. It's different in a lot of ways. And one of them is it's more intense. It's more intense than some of the other practices. And so we have to be on the ball all the time. One of the professors in our tax graduate program, a wonderful guy named Marty McMahon, who I know a lot of people know, used to say to students, you know, a 90 is a good grade in law school, and you've done well if you get a 90 on a test. In practice, 99 is failing. You have to be right for the right reasons every time. There's no give. There's no mulligans, no do-overs. You have to get it right every time, or else it's going to come back to bite you. We're not done when the judge issues the final decision in planning opportunities, because there is no judge, there is no final order. So ours is always open, and so you have to be intense all the time. That's the first lesson. The second lesson is do it right. Do it right. No shortcuts. No shortcuts. No afternoon off. No phoning it in or mailing it in, so to speak. You have to get it right. You have to be on the money. And the only way to do that, the only way to do it, is to work through it and do the work. Learn how to work with younger lawyers and seniors who have been through this before, and work as a team to get through it. But if everyone has the right attitude on your team, they're going to do that. And so with that, those are the seeds for developing a good law practice, a good tax law practice.
Well, Sam, I think you've dropped a lot of wisdom for us here. We really do appreciate your time today. How can people find out more about your practice, find you on the internet, and all that stuff?
I'm easy to find. Just shoot me an email. I'll respond. I love it. As I tell my class, I've had the greatest career on the planet just being a tax lawyer. So I'll talk about tax law with anybody, anytime. My email address is sullman, SULLMAN, at Bilzin, my law firm in Miami. B as in boy, IL, Z as in zebra, IN.com. sullman at Bilzin.com, and I will respond.
Excellent. We'll put that in the show notes for anybody who's picking this up, and we'll put a link to your profile there on the Bilzin website. Well, thank you very much for your time, Sam, and we'll see you around the way.
Steve, thanks so much. I hope to see you at Amelia Island this summer.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for listening to the Florida Bar Tax Section podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review this podcast in iTunes or wherever you listen. Again, nothing in this podcast is legal advice. Please seek counsel of your own choosing before making decisions that impact yourself or your business. Thank you for listening.